Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for SAGE Methodspace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Daria Khanolainen. And we're going to talk a little bit about her research with the use of graphic vignettes. But before we get started with that, if you are new to Methodspace, this is a site that is sponsored by SAGE Publishing. We're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting research, writing about it, and sharing results in all kinds of ways. You can see at the center of this Venn diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or a very experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's why I'm pleased to hear about the kind of new approaches that you are coming up with, Daria. So why don't you begin by introducing yourself?
Thank you for having me. And I'm a doctoral student at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. My research projects are all very different, and my doctoral project is actually quite quantitative, and I'm looking at literacy and numeracy development. But also before I came to Jyväskylä, I was conducting a lot of qualitative research in Russia, and we were exploring sensitive topics such as bullying, cyberbullying, and indigenous issues. So we were mostly focused on qualitative research, and we were using both traditional qualitative approaches and more experimental or non-traditional qualitative approaches.
Great. Well, I think it's really valuable to have that kind of wide range of research experience because you can each approach can inform the other. So today we're going to talk about your work with graphic vignettes, which I think is a really a fascinating approach for engaging with participants. So why don't you explain what you mean by graphic vignettes?
So a graphic vignette as a method, it's a combination of 3 different methodological approaches. So it's a combination of narrative method, and then graphic elicitation, and also text-based vignettes. So in it, when researchers are using text-based vignettes, they're asking their participants to react to a situation presented to them in text. When researchers are using a narrative approach, they're expecting their participants to create a storyline, some kind of narrative. And then when researchers are using graphic elicitation, they're expecting participants to create some kind of visual content. And so a graphic vignette combines all of that. So basically, if you're receiving as a participant, what you're receiving is the beginning of the story, which has both this visual component and textual component, and your task as a participant to create a full story around that. And you might write something, or you might want to draw something, it's up to you. So the task is to develop the story into a full storyline.
Great. So I mean, it really kind of draws on multiple forms of intelligence, or the right and left side of the brain, and it would seem to be a very rich kind of a way to communicate with participants. So why don't you walk us through the main steps of the process you would take to conduct such a study?
So I will share this slide just to be able to look at my notes. So the first main step is to just think about what is your goal, because there is no one algorithm for creating your vignettes. So unless you're trying to replicate somebody else's study, you wouldn't have vignettes. So you would have to develop them yourself. And to be able to do that, you would have to first look at the literature and kind of the beginning is quite standard for any research project. You're just looking for something, what is missing in literature and why is it missing. Maybe a specific research question is just too difficult to approach with existing methods. So you're looking at that, and then you also ask yourself, how much space for creativity do I want to allow to my participants? On the one hand, you of course want to allow a lot of space because that's the point of having an arts-based project. But on the other hand, if you allow too much space, some participants might feel intimidated, or they might just feel overwhelmed with the task. And so some structure would help participants to start thinking, and they might, some structure will help them understand what is the purpose of the project and what they're expected to do. So it just depends on what kind of population you're dealing with and what is your goal behind the project. And then you would also need to ask yourself, how many characters do I want to have? And just giving some examples from my work, in one of our studies, we had multiple characters because we wanted to explore what are the different roles that people might have in a bullying situation, because we know that bullying is a group phenomenon. So traditionally we would have victims and perpetrators, but we also have witnesses, and teachers might have different roles also. Some teachers might be defenders, but some teachers might be making situations worse. So in order to explore a bullying situation and what are the roles that could be there, we had all of the different characters being presented to our participants. But with another study that we had after that, we specifically wanted to focus on victims only, and having just one victim character allowed this specific focus, where participants who had personal experience of being bullied kind of often reported that they were projecting their own personal experiences into the character that they had. But participants who didn't have any personal experience, they would kind of project their perceptions of how they perceive victims. So often students have classmates who they witness to be bullied, and so how do they react to situations like that? And do they is there some victim blaming, or do they contrary to that, maybe they feel a lot of empathy for the victim? So kind of to explore their perceptions of the victim, it was also quite useful to have that specific focus in that study. So just asking all of those questions from yourself and answering them will help you develop your specific set of vignettes. But then after you develop your vignettes, the next step would be to develop rapport with your participants. And it's very important because this is non-traditional task, and some participants might say, I don't have any artistic skills. I feel like I have nothing to contribute here. So there could be some resistance, and to overcome that, you really need to take some time to explain the goal, and that you are not going to be judging their artistic skills, that you have a different goal in mind, and kind of spending time to reassure them that everything is anonymous. And also just sort of if you're taking your time to explain the whole goal behind your project, is really going to create more engagement from participants. So I think this is a very important step, to just not rush in, but to be patient and spend some time with your participants. And then the next step, of course, would be already kind of using your methods. And first you would have this creative part of the study where you're giving out your vignettes and you're asking your participants to work with your vignettes. So they would see the beginning of the story, and then they would have time to reflect, and they would have time to draw or write something down and then think again. So you're just allowing time for them to work with your materials. And then after that, you're just collecting all of the artworks, and you would organize one-on-one interviews. And so you would welcome each participant and show them their creative work, and you would ask them to comment on what it is that you created, and you're just listening to them telling you what it is that they created, what it is that they wanted to communicate with their works. And then you're just asking questions about specific visual details maybe, or some words that they written down. And yeah, it's just kind of being curious about the artwork that they created and asking questions, and participants are very usually very happy to tell you what it is that they created. And sometimes you know, some researchers might think that you need to interpret their creative works, but actually the interpretation is done by participants themselves. So I think that's very important, to also not to look into yourself too much and to think, oh, there is a metaphor. If you think there is a metaphor in their artwork, you really need to ask them, is there actually a metaphor? Or maybe they wanted to communicate something else, because sometimes you might see a visual detail there, and you're not sure if why is it there. And some participants might just say, oh, I just added this because I thought that it would look pretty, but maybe sometimes there could be really a deep meaning behind a specific detail. So yeah, it's really just kind of asking questions, asking questions from participants, and them explaining what they wanted to create. And then just after that, you're analyzing your data. And I provided, here's a little example of what you might expect. And so when analyzing your data, you would have both their artworks and interview scripts. You're just kind of going through both components at the same time, and you're contrasting, kind of finding contrasts and similarities, and what are the reoccurring components. And for example, in one of the studies, what we found is that participants who didn't have any personal experience of being bullied, some of them had very negative perceptions of victims, and they even put some smirks on their victims' faces, and kind of it was clear that they didn't really have that much empathy for them, and kind of just saying, oh, victims, either they would create a victim that doesn't have any emotions, or a victim that is actually happy about their situation. And then in contrast to that, participants who had personal experience of being bullied, they often added a lot of emotions. So they would add details like tears or very sad faces to their victims, and they would provide, they would add text that clearly communicated a lot of distress, a lot of pain that their characters were going through. So kind of, yeah, so analyzing both their scripts and their creative works at the same time. And then
before you go on,
yeah,
go back to this one. So then what you presented to the participants, did you have the figures, or did they draw the figures?
So we had the figure, but it didn't have any emotions.
Right. Okay.
So
just like a kind of a blank figure, but then so like you were saying before about the taking away some of the intimidation of, oh, I'm the blank page, I'm going to have to draw something from scratch, but it's more giving them a little bit of framework. So that's it. You might say in the qualitative lingo, it's sort of semi-structured because you're providing that framework that they can then fill in with the detail. And then you've got the visual data as well as the explanation that they've given as a verbal data. And then you've also got the text. So you really are collecting very rich data.
Yes, and also another thing to point out is that the word bullying is actually, I think it's has different meanings in different languages, and this study was conducted in Switzerland and in Russia, and I think especially in the Russian context, bullying is usually is a very strong word, and it's only used when some physical violence is involved. And so, and of course, if we're using an academic definition of bullying, of course, it doesn't have to be physical violence. So what we wanted to kind of to have the same understanding for all of the participants across countries. And so we wouldn't use the word bullying at all. And we would just kind of communicate a specific situation with the drawing and the victim saying something like, oh, for example, why do they hate me so much? So we have this input that the victim isn't doing okay. And we have the visual component as well, but the visual component is quite ambiguous, and we don't see their emotions, and we actually, well, so it's up to you to develop and to decide, is this a very bad situation or is it kind of not that bad? And yeah, so I think with what was important is not to use the word bullying at all throughout the interview, and we only used it at the very end to just to see what is the definition of bullying of a specific participant. And what often happened is that some participants would report having been bullied, but they wouldn't use the word bullying. And then at the end, they would, being asked directly, how have you ever been bullied? They would say, no, that never happens in our school, and clearly communicating that they have a very different definition of bullying.
Right. So in some ways, I think it sounds like the graphic element also helps you to deal with those differences in culture and language and interpretation, and really get to the heart of the phenomenon you're trying to study. So, so please go on to your next slide.
Yes, here it's an example of how verbal and visual accounts enhance each other. And so this specific participant created this visual, and then here is a quote that was accompanying this visual component. And first, if you're just listening to what this participant was saying, there is nothing concerning, not that much. This participant previously admitted to being bullied by his classmates, and so, and this participant was switching from talking about his character to talking about himself, and then back and forth. And it was kind of when a person has this personal experience, it may be natural for them to say things like, oh, I would want those people to be gone, them not wanting some people to be present in their classroom. But once you look at this visual component, actually, I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Saw, but it's basically this. This is a picture of a puppet in a movie Saw that the serial killer in that movie was using to deliver to his when a serial killer wanted to punish somebody, then they would send this puppet to communicate that something bad is going to happen to you, and that you're gonna get your that the serial killer was going to take revenge on that person. And so once you see this component, of course, then the words I have always wanted to get rid, doesn't matter how to get rid of these people, then of course kind of it starts sounding differently once you see this visual. So it's kind of, yeah, so it's just an example how verbal and visual accounts can enhance each other.
So I think you've answered the question that I was going to ask you about why this approach is useful for studying sensitive topics. And I think, you know, the example you've just given where the, you know, if we were only doing the straight question and answer interview, there's a whole dimension that would have been missed. But
yeah,
do you feel that it kind of opens up for the participants, kind of another channel of expression?
Yes, definitely. And then also when dealing with sensitive research topics, what is important is to allow some distance, because it's very difficult for some participants to just immediately start talking about their negative experiences. But once they have some time to first think about the topic and reflect, and then kind of talk, first they would talk about their character, and so they having that character there creates this safe distance between your participant and the researcher. And it's kind of this warm up before they will tell you about their personal experience. It is really you know, it kind of, it helps them to talk about this imaginary character first. And then at some point our participants would talk about the character, and then they would say, actually, you know, this story is based on my experience, this is what happened to me. But the whole time they were talking about, okay, this is the character, this is what is happening to the character, and then at the end only revealing that this is actually my story here.
So when you're doing your data analysis, you're really looking at the images, the text, and the verbal response that's been transcribed together. I mean, it's not a situation where, say, you know, some people watching this might think, oh, well, gee, how would I analyze the visual element? That really what you're going by is the participant's description of that. So the visual is really just kind of it's that elicitation piece of,
yes,
it's creating a kind of a stepping stone to open up the conversation. So so you know, the analysis would be more of a holistic approach to looking at all of those pieces together.
Yes, definitely.
So for our Methodspace viewers who are watching this, what kind of skills do you think are valuable for a researcher to have if they want to try this kind of approach? How did you learn how to do this, and what, you know, what should someone think about developing to do this kind of study?
Yeah, so maybe the standard skill set that any researcher has, any qualitative researcher has, would be needed. But also, when I started out this project, we really didn't know what was going to happen. So it was kind of, we were learning as we went. And so one of the first skills that we needed to develop is to how to gain access into schools, because in Russia, what was difficult is that a lot of head teachers were saying, we don't have any bullying in our school and you don't have anything to study here. So in just kind of going from one head teacher to another and saying, look, this is important, and it doesn't mean that we assume that there is a horrible bullying problem in your school. We just want to, you know, to invite any participants regardless of their experiences. And so kind of that was the first thing. But then I think also being patient and understanding that this projects, because they're non-traditional, there could be some skepticism, and so you would have some time you would have to spend some time explaining why you think this project is needed, what potentially new insights it can provide, and then just sort of being assertive, and saying, we really need this. And yeah, and then another thing, also being patient with your participants and spending enough time with them to explain why your project is important and what it is that you're trying to find out, and why their role is so important. And yeah, just sort of being patient. But I guess you need to be patient in any research project.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you have someone on your team who was responsible for creating those kind of the boilerplate images that were used, like the cartoon figures, or were those things that you were able to use from stock figures? Or
I created them myself, because my undergraduate degree was in arts and art education. So kind of that background helped me. But yes, I guess if a researcher is starting out and they don't have any background in art, they might want to collaborate with somebody who has those artistic skills.
Right, and I've seen there are software programs out there for creating graphic novels, which are of course very popular with young people, and have kind of stock figures. So you think, well, someone who doesn't have that capability could find those.
Yeah.
And that is actually another reason why I thought that this approach would be really appealing to young people, because the graphic novels are so popular. It's something familiar to them.
Yes, definitely. With some stock images, though, there could be already some kind of emotion on the face of a character. So you would have to evaluate, do I want this emotion to be there, or do I want to kind of change the face to allow more ambiguity?
Right. Well, that seems like a very valuable approach, and I think there are so many sensitive topics like the one that you mentioned that would be conducive to this kind of study. So we will post the links to your articles with the video, and hope that these ideas will be useful to other researchers. And thank you very much for sharing your experience.
Thank you. Thank you.